If you clicked on this because you've looked in a mirror and just not liked what looked back at you, this one's for you. Not in a vague motivational poster way. I mean literally. This is about why that happens, biologically and psychologically. Most people assume that feeling means something's actually wrong with their face. I used to think that too, before I started digging into the research. Usually, that's not it. The face is, more often than not, completely normal. What's off is somewhere else, somewhere most people never think to look. Quick question, and be honest for a second. Have you ever asked someone to delete a group photo because you thought your face looked wrong in it, while everyone else in that photo thought you looked totally fine? If that's happened to you, you're not alone. And by the time this I'm not going to tell you to just love yourself, because that advice is pretty useless at 2 a.m. when you're standing in front of a mirror picking apart your own nose. I get it. It's lonely. It feels like nobody else thinks about their face this way. They do, though. A lot more people than you'd guess. And the reason turns out to be stranger and honestly more fixable than most people assume. So here's where it gets a little unexpected. Researchers at UCLA scanned the brains of people who struggle with this kind of intense face hatred. Clinically, it's called body dysmorphic disorder, BDD for short, expecting to find something unusual tied specifically to how they look at faces. That's not really what turned up. The unusual activity showed up even when people looked at blurry photos of completely ordinary things. Houses, furniture, nothing to do with a face at all. Which says something kind of interesting if you sit with it. The brain isn't zooming in on your face because it's your face. It seems to zoom in because that's just how it processes things in general. One detail at a time, blown up bigger than it should be. It just happens that your reflection is the thing you stare at the most. There's a related finding that's almost funny in a dark way. Researchers borrowed a test originally built for anorexia research, where you guess your own measurements and then get checked against actual calipers, real numbers. When they ran the same test on people with BDD, the guesses were consistently off. Not just this looks bad off, but physically wrong. Bigger, wider, more prominent than it actually is. So this isn't really an opinion problem. It's closer to a ruler that's stuck reading the wrong number every single time. And honestly, this next part is the one that got me. Most brains don't just measure you accurately, they actually cheat in your favor a little. There's a study where researchers blended people's real photos with slightly more attractive versions of themselves, mixed those into a photo lineup, and most participants picked the enhanced version as more like me, and picked it faster than the real, unedited photo. What's interesting is that this only happened for their own face and for people close to them, not for strangers. So there's a built-in flattery setting, reserved just for you and the people you love. For people with BDD, that setting doesn't just switch off. In some cases, it flips entirely, and instead of rounding you up, it rounds you down. At this point, you might be wondering whether this is just a way of thinking or something actually built into the brain. Probably both, honestly. Brain scans have found real structural differences in people with BDD, not just unusual activity in the moment, but a different shape in a region called the orbitofrontal cortex, which sits right behind your eyes. That's a physical difference, not a mood thing. There's also a connection that doesn't come up much outside psychiatric research circles. This same detail over whole picture style of seeing has been linked to something called weak central coherence, a theory originally built to explain autistic perception. There are documented cases of people with both autism and BDD where researchers think the same local over global processing style is driving both things. That doesn't mean they're the same condition. They're clearly not. But it's a real overlap, and worth knowing about if either of those words apply to you. None of this is new, by the way. People have written about it for well over 100 years. Back in 1891, an Italian psychiatrist named Enrico Morselli coined the term dysmorphophobia for patients convinced they were deformed when nothing was visibly wrong. It took almost 90 years to land an official spot in the diagnostic manual doctors use. That happened in 1980, and it wasn't renamed body dysmorphic disorder until 1987. Even Freud wrote about a patient, his so-called Wolfman case, who was fixated on his own nose. So no, this isn't something social media invented. Social media just handed it a much bigger microphone. It's not even aimed in the same direction everywhere in the world, which I find genuinely fascinating. In Japan, there's a documented condition called taijin kyofusho, where the central fear isn't I look ugly to myself, it's that your appearance might embarrass or offend other people. Same basic fear architecture, just pointed outward instead of inward. Which tells you something. This was probably never really about the face being objectively bad. It's about where a misfiring alarm happens to point. So where does all this actually come from? I wish I had a clean answer. It's messier than that. Twin studies put the genetic contribution somewhere around 40 to 50%. That leaves a lot of room for environment. And one piece of that surprised me when I first read it. In one study, 92% of parents of teenagers with BDD said they'd restructured parts of their family's daily life around their kids' appearance worries, covering mirrors, constant reassurance, avoiding certain situations together. It comes from love. No parent is doing this to hurt their kid, obviously. But researchers have linked that pattern to the condition lasting longer and getting harder to treat. The same dynamic seen in childhood OCD. Comfort, given the wrong way, can end up watering the exact thing it's trying to protect someone from. That's a hard thing to sit with, honestly, because it means well-meaning love can still make things worse. This also rarely shows up alone. Around 30% of people with BDD also meet criteria for an eating disorder. Same distorted mirror machinery, just aimed at a different part of the body. And here's a number that genuinely stopped me when I first read it. About 15.6% of people walking into cosmetic surgery consultations meet criteria for BDD, compared to roughly 2% of the general population. That's not a small gap. A lot of people end up trying to fix a broken ruler by changing what the ruler is measuring. And surgery on its own usually can't recalibrate something happening inside someone's head. For a smaller group of people, this stops being a worry they can question and turns into something closer to certainty. There's an actual clinical label for this, the absent insight or delusional belief specifier, which marks the difference between someone who knows somewhere that their belief might be distorted and someone who's lost that doubt completely. To be clear, that doesn't mean schizophrenia or some other separate diagnosis. The doubt has just gone quiet. I want to slow down for the next part. It's not here for shock value. It's just true, and I'd rather say it plainly than dance around it. This condition carries one of the highest suicide attempt rates of any disorder in its category. Roughly 80% of people with BDD report having suicidal thoughts at some point, and somewhere between 24 and 28% attempt suicide. If parts of this video have felt a little too familiar, I want to say this clearly, not as a throwaway line. This is treatable. There's an actual path through it, and it's not just think positive. Standard antidepressant doses, the kind used for depression, usually aren't strong enough here. Clinical guidance for BDD typically calls for higher doses, taken for longer than a typical depression trial, a detail that mostly stays buried in specialist literature. And the treatment with the strongest evidence behind it isn't open-ended talk therapy. It's something called exposure and response prevention, the same approach used for OCD, adapted specifically to target mirror checking, covering up, and constantly asking other people for reassurance. It's been studied for decades, and for a lot of people, it works. So, if there's one thing I want you to take from all this, it's that the problem was probably never your actual face. It's more likely a measuring system in your brain that got knocked slightly out of calibration by wiring you didn't choose, maybe sharpened a bit by people who were only ever trying to help. That doesn't fix everything overnight, and I'm not going to pretend it does. But next time that voice shows up while you're looking in a mirror, it might help to remember it's probably not handing you accurate information. It's closer to a glitch, and glitches, with the right kind of help, can actually be worked on. If you want to go deeper into what's happening in your brain in the few seconds right before you start picking yourself apart,